This is John Nichols of The Nation magazine, and you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host, David Feldman. Hello, David.
Hello, Steve.
And, of course, as always, our producer, Hannah Feldman. Hello, Hannah.
Hello, Steve.
And it's not a Ralph Nader Radio Hour without the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello, everybody.
One of the phrases you'll often hear so-called conservatives use is personal responsibility. They insist that it's up to the individual to take responsibility for their own plight. They'll say this about the homeless, those stuck in poverty, the climate crisis, obesity, or the idea that, quote, guns don't kill people, people kill people. If individuals would simply change their behavior, then the problems would go away. Our first guest is Professor Nick Chater, who co-authored the book, It's on You, How Corporations and Behavioral Scientists Have Convinced Us That We're to Blame for Society's Deepest Problems. In the book, he and his co-author, George Lowenstein, argued that the rich and powerful repeatedly blame individuals for social problems while lobbying against the systemic changes that could actually fix those problems. And this type of thinking has been supported by the behavioral science industry that attempts to nudge people to change. Those techniques prove to be ineffective because they do not address the underlying system that causes the problems in the first place. Then we welcome back Dr. Feroze Sidhwa, an American trauma surgeon who volunteered in Gaza's besieged hospitals in both 2024 and 2025. He was also the author of the acclaimed and viral New York Times op-ed entitled 65 Doctors, Nurses, and Paramedics, What We Saw in Gaza, which caused a sensation because, among other things, they revealed x-rays of Palestinian children with single bullet holes in their heads from IDF snipers. We're going to speak to him about the three-part series of articles he has written for the website Zeteo entitled The Truth About Gaza's Dead. The series details for the layperson what is known about the death toll of the U.S.-Israeli assault on Gaza that began after the Hamas-led October 7th attacks. As always, somewhere in the middle, we'll check in with our relentless corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, are you the problem, or is it the system? Hannah?
Nick Chater is professor of behavioral science at Warwick Business School in Coventry, England. He has written and co-written more than 200 research papers and 6 books, including It's on You, How Corporations and Behavioral Scientists Have Convinced Us That We're to Blame for Society's Deepest Problems, co-written with George Lowenstein. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Nick Chater.
Well, thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here.
Yeah, welcome indeed. Now, this book, unlike any other author book, listeners, is a mea culpa. You say, quote, writing this book has taken us in unexpected directions. We started out frustrated by the ineffectiveness of individual-focused behavioral interventions, including those that we ourselves were developing and testing, to make meaningful inroads into persistent social problems. But as we dug deeper into the question of why nudges often come up short, nudges of, say, cigarette smokers to stop smoking, we begin to see our work and that of many of our talented colleagues as unintentionally supporting the agenda of special interests, which try to distract the public debate by focusing on individuals rather than on rules and systems where the real levers for change are found, end quote.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. This is definitely a mea culpa book. And the example of domain that's most salient for me is thinking about carbon reduction, because I was on a UK government committee as the representative for behavioral science for 6 years, where my role, at least I understood my role to be coming up with smart aleck ideas about what individual nudges or bits of useful information we could give to the public, how that would help people reduce their carbon emissions. And I came away from that experience extremely chastened because almost all the interesting issues were nothing to do whatsoever with individual behavior. They were all about big systemic changes, just changes in the way manufacturing works and food production works, the way we have to electrify everything, we have to shift to clean production of electricity, and so on and so on. And the shock for me was realizing that the tools that I was hoping to wield were in fact completely ineffective. So let me take a couple of examples from that domain. The kind of thing that I used to be very keen on were things like the thought that we might default people into green energy tariffs. So one of the famous nudges, these changes in the the sort of details of the way options are given to people, which are supposedly going to help them make a difference for the good. So one of them is defaulting. So the idea is that people tend to be fairly inert. We all are. So if you're defaulted into something, you tend to stick with it. So let's default people into green energy. So the story goes. And this has, to some extent, been tried, in fact, in quite a large trial in Switzerland. And this sounds very good. And there's been lots of hullabaloo about it in parts of our field, because you can indeed, if you default people into green energy, get more people into green energy. However, of course, the trouble is that the total amount of green energy being produced is exactly the same. All you're doing is an accounting trick in which the company who's selling the electricity moves people from one part of their ledger into another part. So there's lots of people now with pure green energy. All the other people have much browner energy than before. And the total production of wind and solar is exactly the same. So it's a completely pointless exercise, but it sort of feels from a sort of an intuitive point of view that you're really making a difference. So that's the kind of thing that's a complete waste of time, I think. And I've wasted many hours thinking about how to do that effectively. Another one, and there are so many, is giving people better information about their energy use. So I don't think this is a purposeless thing to do. I think it's useful for people to know how much energy they're using. Having better real-time data can help one use less energy. Knowing what your neighbors are using, what you used in the past, all of that, it's helpful. And companies in the US like O-Power have done trials where they give people better access to energy information. And yes, they do, some of them reduce their energy consumption, but we're talking about 1 or 2%. That's the sort of figure we're talking about with those studies. So if you were thinking, as I used to think, that these behavioral interventions could really make a difference in moving the needle towards a cleaner, greener world, then you're barking up the wrong tree, because this is making a very small impact. And I think the same story is just true everywhere. So there are nudges to try to get people to litter, to put their litter in litter bins. These are not terribly effective. One of the most famous is eyes, or watching eyes, which are near the litter bin, which somehow make one feel more concerned about the being observed. I mustn't litter because these watching eyes are watching me. And this may have a marginal effect. It's a small effect, but it's a truly trivial effect compared to the question of how many disposable plastics are being pumped into the planet, because there's a vast industry producing disposable plastics. So this is not news to activists and campaigners. And I think, Ralph, I think it's absolutely true that many of the things that behavioral scientists are supposedly discovering, in inverted commas, the things that campaigners and activists and indeed people in the political world generally and journalists intuitively have long known and indeed probably have good evidence for. It's a sort of a sad process of trailing along behind, which I think the academic world has been engaged in, where we've been slowly realizing that things that everybody else knew initially are actually true after all.
You do say in your book that industry will be anxious to advance a popular narrative that holds individuals responsible for the systemic problems it creates itself, industry. So you talk about the retirement pension industry,
Yep.
You talk about the health insurance industry, you
Yep.
talk about the credit industry, you talk about the cigarette industry, and as you mentioned, the renewable energy versus fossil fuels. Can you run us by several of these to make your points more specific?
Yes, absolutely. So I think that the framing here is that I think the key bit of psychology is that it's very hard for us to see a problem from more than one point of view at a time. And so many social problems, we could potentially think of them from an individual perspective. So I need to change my behavior to reduce my carbon, to save for my future, to smoke less or not at all, or to reduce my intake of fatty foods and so on. So I can think of it as a problem for me, the individual, and everybody else as individuals, or I can think of it as a problem of the system. The political system is working, there's incentives we have, regulations, lack of regulations, international agreements. So the trouble is that given the way we're wired, if we think about things from an individualistic perspective, we tend not to think about the system. For example, if you take obesity, say, we know it's clear that obesity has been increasing rapidly in the US, the UK, across many parts of the both Western world and developing world. You might think, well, from a sort of political or campaigning point of view, it's clearly obvious that one of the forces that's driving that is the massive growth in energy-dense foods and the gigantic marketing campaigns which are pushing those foods at large numbers of people. But that's the systemic frame, the system frame. But the individual frame is focusing on individual, sort of weight loss, individual control of our diets and the amount we exercise and so on. And the crucial bit of psychology, as I say here, is that these frames tend to mutually block each other. So this means that if I'm thinking about my own obesity as an issue of self-control and an issue of my own responsibility, then I tend to defocus on the systemic forces that are causing obesity at large. So this means that it's really attractive for industry in any domain where these sorts of issues arise to push what the sociologists have termed an agenda of responsibilization. So it's very helpful for industries who want not to be regulated very heavily to tell people it's an individual problem. You have to worry about your own weight. You have to worry about your own carbon emissions. It will help you do it, but it's really your problem. Similarly with savings, it's up to you to put the right amount of money aside and so on and so on. And you see that all over the place. So many of your listeners will be very well aware, in context of climate, the idea of an individual carbon calculator, so we can each monitor our own carbon footprint, that was both created and propagated by BP, which is one of the world's largest oil companies. And it was not done, of course, with the intention of particularly helping reduce the consumption of fossil fuels. What it's doing is individualizing the problem, saying it's not our problem, it's your problem. Each of you citizens needs to take up that problem and solve it yourselves. And if we're all worried about that, then we're worried about both ourselves, but about other people. We can start blaming each other. We can start vilifying climate scientists for flying to conferences, and we can just generally get into a tangle in which we're wondering which individuals are to blame. And that distracts us away from the big question, which is these big systemic forces. Similarly with litter, the big campaigns, the Crying Indian campaign and onwards in the US, are funded, as again, many of your listeners will know, they're funded by the packaging and drinks industry. So that, again, the ostensible story is we're very, very worried about littering and plastic waste. And we're going to help with this helpful campaign. But of course, what it's really doing is individualizing the problem. It's saying this problem of all this plastic leaking into the world's ecosystems is a problem for individuals to litter more carefully in the trash can, rather than, well, hang on, why is it possible to create such vast amounts of non-recyclable or non-recycled in practice plastic? Same, I think another great example that you mentioned was retirement savings. It's not so long ago, of course, that the start of retirement savings was a defined benefit scheme, which allowed people to be sure of what they would get when they retired, and that would allow them to live reasonably well. That has been deemed to be unaffordable by businesses in the pensions industry, where unaffordable means it would be cheaper to do something different. And what the cheaper thing we've got is the shift to defined contribution schemes, which are essentially, as your listeners will be very familiar with, you have your own pile of money and you just try to invest it as best you can. So that, of course, it doesn't share risk across people. It doesn't give you any way of dealing with the risk about uncertainty about your own lifespan and so on. And indeed, usually the performance of these schemes is not particularly good. But the responsibilization trick, as we think of it, a sort of sleight of hand, is to say, well, if you're having trouble with your financial position in retirement, it's your own problem. You've got to have put more money aside or should have invested it more wisely. And the fact that we've shifted from a scheme which was actually pretty advantageous for most workers who had those schemes, clearly one could always have had them on a larger, broader scale, and we've shifted to a totally different scheme, which is essentially makes the problem well nigh impossible for most of us.
One of the subtexts is, Nick, is you're attacking the whole concept of consumer education in our schools, for example, and all the self-help books that come out, all the articles in the New York Times and Post on how you can maneuver to minimize your exploitation by banks and insurance companies and credit card companies, consumer advice columns. Now, you've heard this probably many times. It isn't an either or, is it? In other words, if people start trying to control their own garden, so to speak, what they can control, because they can control what they eat and what they expose themselves to, bad food, for example, or drugs that aren't working and so on, that they hear about, over-the-counter drugs, that if they focus on their own deficiencies and try to self-correct and self-improve, they become more aware of how they're being exploited systemically, and therefore move from simply consumer self-improvement, say, or worker self-improvement, into the arena of advocacy for systemic change, which, of course, you talk about in your book. You indicate in some parts of your book you're sensitive to that it isn't really an either or, it's attempt to get rid of the zero-sum relationship, that basically it doesn't matter what you do individually on climate change. It's what the government does to replace fossil fuels with solar and wind power and conservation of energy. Can you elaborate the plea by a person who says, look, I'm way overweight. I know why I'm overweight. I don't exercise. I eat fatty food. I can reduce my obesity. And now he's telling me it's really the fast food and ultra-processed foods' fault.
Yeah, I think the key here is exactly the problem that psychologically we do find it very hard to hold these two frames in our mind, and they do tend to compete, but they absolutely needn't do. So I think you're absolutely right that it's a perfectly rational and probably the most rational perspective to think, well, clearly that there's more obesity across the world, and the reason there's more obesity in some countries than in other countries, these are driven by systemic forces. The reason that I myself am more obese than I used to be, say, that's something that is about my own recent behavior. So there are certain things I can control, but what's dangerous, I think, is that if we get sucked into thinking about the individual perspective, if we do that, we can get sucked away from, we can start to think that, oh, it's my problem and everybody else's obesity is their problem. In fact, we've all just got to take responsibility for our obesity problem. And that means that the industry doesn't really have to take responsibility at all. So I think the synergy that we do want is, and it can happen as you indicated, and I think in cigarette smoking, actually, it's probably a good example. We can get a situation where people who are themselves, for example, trying to give up smoking, are often become quite keen advocates for anti-smoking measures just across the board, because one sees oneself as a victim, or at least pushed around by powerful forces which are not working in one's interests, and one wants to stop that happening to other people and to oneself. And I think that is in principle possible. I think what's actually happened, at least looking at what's happened, this is goes back to the mea culpa point, what's happened with academic research, or at least mine, is that given the sort of amount of attention and budget you have to devote to it, if one starts to focus on these individual questions, your mind just gets captured by how can we solve the obesity crisis by helping individuals pull themselves together, as it were. And there's a dangerous direction, I think, to be going in.
You would add grief, wouldn't you, like Mothers Against Drunk Driving, that led to much tougher enforcement against drunk drivers, pressure on the alcohol industry to stop promoting in their ads ways to get people, young people especially, to drink. You'd include that, the grief?
Oh, no, completely. Issue? No, absolutely. And I think one of the interesting reactions when terrible tragedies do happen is that it does galvanize many people into campaigning mode. And those campaigns are very, very powerful. So I think, and this is hardly news in the context of your career in this show, but I think seeing one of the most powerful things that each of us has is the ability to propagate our own perspective and to campaign and to argue for change. And this is really, really crucial. And I think it's very different from a sort of inward-looking perspective, which is saying, well, I'm going to look after my own garden, but not worry about anybody else's garden. They've got to look after their gardens. I'm just going to look into my, stay in my parochial patch. I think getting people pulling together and pushing for change can be, of course, and you've been more of a part of this than almost anyone, can be incredibly powerful. So seeing ourselves as citizens who are actively able to have our voice, make our voices heard, I think that's where the real power lies. And I think that campaigners and political activists and so on have always known this. And of course, also, big business has also known this too. And they certainly don't want us to be doing too much of that. They want us to be focusing quite the opposite. They want us to be focusing on our own gardens and not worrying about the big picture. They don't want organized opposition.
But before we get into the systemic change and civic advocacy and lobbyists and role of Congress and Parliament, there's one area that didn't seem right to me, and it is you have this distinction of the I-frame trap, and you say to believe that the issue also includes the matter of evil business executives is to fall into the I-frame trap. The I-frame meaning it's blaming the individual, blaming the victim. But, there are evil corporate executives. I mean, let's face it. Some of them are evil by conventional standards. They're actually corporate criminals, killing, injuring, stealing, lying in all directions. So how can you ignore the issue of evil personalities, fraudulent personalities running entire corporate enterprises?
I think the iframe trap, doesn't in any way cut across that point, because I think it's absolutely true that the variety of people in charge of powerful organizations, including governments, from a moral perspective is extremely broad, and it makes a huge difference. I think the thing we're trying to caution against is the line that if people seem like sort of decent folk and they sort of love their families and they kind of seem, they don't seem sort of inherently monstrous. I mean, there may be cases where this isn't true, but there are clearly quite a lot of regular business people they're not unusually virtuous or venal, they're just regular people. But the logic of their organization just demands, the logic of the demands that they maximize shareholder returns and so on, just forces a particular kind of direction of travel for the decisions they're going to make. So, of course, it's absolutely true that beyond that, there can be all kinds of violations of the law and immoral behavior by any standard, and many clearly happens. But even if you don't have that, then you can still have organizations which are inherently going to be pushing against essentially trying to pushing against consumer interests and citizen interests. I suppose I'm just wanting to defend against the thought that what's wrong with the world is it's the wrong people. I think it was probably David Hume who had this line that we should be designing our political systems to defend against knaves, not assuming that everybody is a knave, but we have to have a system which is knave-proof. And we certainly don't have that at the moment. So I mean, I think it's absolutely true. There are, and knaves can prosper. But it's also true, I think, that even morally relatively neutral people inside an organization where the incentives are all wrong and the regulations are all wrong, they'll just be doing things which they'll think, well, here I am, I'm marketing chocolate. I should be trying to sell as much chocolate as possible. That's what I'm here to do. And if I don't do that, that's kind of dereliction of duty. And then I'm going to be telling people that the reason they eat so much chocolate is due to a lack of restraint, and they need to improve their efforts to restrain themselves. And so that that all these kind of patterns can arise even without the additional layer. And then that additional layer may be very, very important in some cases. The additional layer of active vice at the top.
We've been talking with Nick Chater, who with George Lowenstein authored this book, It's on You, How Corporations and Behavioral Scientists Have Convinced Us that we're to blame for society's deepest problems. Very thought-provoking, and it will affect you, citizens, in ways you'll never imagine when you read this book. It's very readable, a lot of examples. Thank you very much, Nick.
Well, thank you so much, Ralph. It's been a real pleasure.
We've been speaking with Professor Nicholas Chater. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. When we come back, we welcome back Dr. Feroze Sidhwa, the trauma surgeon who worked in Gaza and will reveal the truth about Gaza's dead. But first, let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, April 24, 2026. I'm Russell Mokhiber. The Federal Trade Commission last week ordered Rollins, Inc., one of the largest pest control companies in the United States, to stop enforcing non-compete agreements against more than 18,000 employees nationwide. The agency also sent warning letters to 13 other companies in the pest control industry that employ many thousands more workers, urging the firms to review their employment agreements to ensure they do not contain any unfair or anti-competitive non-compete provisions. The company's non-compete agreements prohibited employees from working in pest control within a predetermined distance, typically within a 75-mile radius from one of Rollins' more than 700 locations in the United States. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman, Hannah, and Ralph. Our next guest has done 2 tours of duty as a doctor in besieged Gaza. He returns with his latest report. Hannah?
Dr. Feroze Sidhwa is a general trauma and critical care surgeon in California. He is also a humanitarian surgeon who has worked in Palestine, Ukraine, Haiti, Zimbabwe, and Burkina Faso. He most recently volunteered at Nasser Medical Complex in Khan Yunis, Gaza. He was blocked from entering Gaza by Israel's Shin Bet intelligence service in November 2025. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Dr. Feroze Sidhwa.
Hi, Hannah. Thanks for having me.
Welcome back, Feroze. Listeners should know we're interviewing a very courageous trauma surgeon who works in a veterans hospital in California, but also has proceeded to go into some of the most dangerous areas in the world and minister hands-on to the victims of criminal violence, and he's had 2 round trips in that manner in Gaza. Gaza is now not in the headlines. The issue of Iran is taken away from Gaza, and that has not stopped Dr. Sidhwa from putting out with his colleagues 3 reports. One's called The Truth About Gaza's Death, How We Got Here. That's part 1. Part 2 is The Truth About Gaza's Death Toll, a gross undercount. And part 3 is The Truth About Gaza's Death Toll, What Do We Actually Know? Feroze, describe the situation in Gaza now and how little attention is being given to it because of the diversions of other Middle East conflicts before we get into the death count.
Yeah, the situation in Gaza today is a disaster. I was last there in March and April of 2025. I was supposed to go again in November, but then, like you mentioned, I was blocked from entering. But I do keep in touch with people there. I read the WHO's reports, what they make public at least. And then the situation is just a total disaster. From the standpoint of overall, like you mentioned, the Israeli military is still in control of more than half of the Strip's territory, which means that one of the most crowded places in the world is now certainly by an order of magnitude the most crowded place in the world. It's not even a close question. Beyond being the most crowded place in the world, it's the most crowded place in the world with no infrastructure whatsoever. So to keep human beings alive and, even flourishing in some way in a very concentrated environment, you need modern infrastructure. You need a water system, you need a sewage system, you need electricity, et cetera, et cetera. Gaza doesn't have any of that. I mean, at absolute minimum, what it has, the entire sewage system was destroyed during the assault. The entire water distribution system was destroyed, and it was already pretty much reliant on Israel to begin with, and the Israelis shut off the water pipes for the most part. The only desalination plant in Gaza, or the only large desalination plant in Gaza, has been destroyed. There's no way to bring in chemicals of any kind because they're all considered dual use. Oxfam wrote a report back in 2018 or 2020, I can't even remember now, way before October 7th, talking about how it had taken them something like 10 months to just try and get a few filters for their water supply units in Gaza in, because the Israeli entry system for everything is just so opaque and complex and ridiculous that it's impossible to navigate. They'd be told something is approved, they'd show up with it. It's not approved, you have to go back. Now it's in a warehouse. It's just total mess. And we should point out, or I should point out, I guess, that right now it's not actually even accurate to call it Israel's blockade of Gaza, because now it's literally a joint U.S.-Israeli operation. There is an American military base just east of Gaza in a town called Kiryat Gat called the CMCC. It stands for Civilian Military Coordination Center. This thing was created ostensibly to coordinate the entry of humanitarian aid into Gaza and to take it out of Israel's hands, to put it in American hands. It was kind of interesting. The New York Times actually wrote an interesting article about it maybe 5 months ago now, 6 months ago, something like that. And in that piece, they described that the U.S. military had sent its best logistics people to the CMCC. And those logistics people's job was to start getting stuff into Gaza because not enough was going in. Nowhere near the 600 trucks a day that's in the so-called ceasefire agreement. Well, the logistics people all just left after a few weeks. They said there's no logistics problem. Gaza's right there. There's plenty of roads going to it. It's not some mountainous region that you can't access. You need helicopters. You just drive over there. The reason that there's nothing going into Gaza is because the U.S. insists on asking Israel if this thing can go to Gaza, and they say no to everything, so nothing goes in. Well, okay, it's a pretty simple problem. You don't need logistics experts to solve that. It's a political problem. Actually, I have a friend, I won't say his name just because I probably shouldn't, but I have an Israeli friend. He's a professor. I stayed with him just recently. I was in Israel itself in December. And he's been to the CMCC a few times, and it's kind of an amazing thing. There's these giant screens on the wall. This is just to show you how serious this place is. There's these giant screens on the wall. One screen has an American drone feed that's just flying over Gaza. It doesn't show anything of any interest to anybody. It's just a random drone feed. And then the other screen is Donald Trump's Truth Social account. That's it. That's what these people are looking at all day long. It's just a complete joke. So the U.S. is completely, not just complicit, but directly involved in this continued blockade of the Gaza Strip. And I should say the U.S. and Israel together are still only allowing less than half of what's supposed to enter Gaza under the ceasefire arrangement. The stuff that's entering Gaza, it's actually not even clear how much of it gets to the Palestinians, because remember, half of Gaza is under Israeli military control. Like the American media loves to do this. They report that anything that entered what is called the Gaza Strip entered Gaza. It's technically true, but it entered Israeli-controlled Gaza. It may not have even gone to the Palestinians. It's a completely outrageous situation. In terms of healthcare in Gaza, the U.S. and Israel are doing something that I think is quite dastardly. I told many reporters about it, but they don't seem interested in covering it. What they're doing is they're allowing the pittance of medical supplies that are being allowed to go in, and some is being allowed to go in, are not being allowed to supply Ministry of Health hospitals. So like, for example, where I worked, European Hospital and Nasser Medical Complex, those places are not allowed to get medical resupply. And so they basically have nothing left inside of them. Basically, every medicine is at a critical shortage or just absent. And these are basic medicines. We're not talking about Wegovy or something like that. We're talking about things that people need to stay alive. These medicines are only being allowed to resupply the NGO clinics and the field hospitals that exist. So like the Jordanian military has a field hospital. There's some other field hospitals. So basically anything that the Palestinians could actually have some say in because they have their own government, et cetera, is being denied. But the NGOs can get it. So now every doctor in Gaza who makes a diagnosis, they're just texting all their friends saying, does this clinic have this medicine? Does this clinic, because nothing is available in the Ministry of Health system. So, that's quite impressive, but it's quite a dastardly way of undermining Palestinian sovereignty while still claiming that you're allowing healthcare resources in. And this generalizes to basically the entire Strip's infrastructure, the sewage system, the water system, the food distribution system, the housing system, the educational system. Everything that keeps people alive is just completely verboten from either going in at all, or if it does going to Palestinians who would actually control it. It goes to an NGO or a field hospital that's run by a foreign government. So it's an interesting way of continuing a genocidal assault to allow some.
Well, they also have destroyed the limited agricultural production areas of Gaza, including destroying 1.1 million olive trees, a major crop, if not the major crop in Gaza. And also our weapons have destroyed over 800 mosques in Gaza and 3 churches and universities and museums, and nothing escaped. The greatest, most intense bombing. Archives. Yeah, that's right. The most intense bombing of a defenseless population in world history.
I don't think there's even a close second for that prize. Gaza is 2 million people crammed into an area the size of Philadelphia, and it's had something like these are obviously imprecise measures, but something like the equivalent of 8 Hiroshima atomic bombs dropped on it. But they weren't dropped. It's not like, when an atomic bomb explodes, it just explodes in one place and it goes outward. This was pinpointing each little bit of TNT into where the Israelis and the Americans wanted it to go, So there's nothing even remotely close. And just as someone who's been there, I'll tell you, the place, it does look like an atomic bomb hit the place. I mean, it's absolutely incredible.
The first incredulity is that if we accept the Ministry of Health in Gaza's figures, that means 96% of the people in Gaza are still alive. Although, as you say, many of them are sick, injured, or dying. That's totally incredible. Now, you talk about Air Wars, a very well-regarded British non-governmental research firm that investigates how air campaigns affect civilians in wartime. They've studied 12 conflicts around the world so far, including the current assault on Gaza. Tell us what they've come up with in terms of comparing the number of civilian deaths per day in Gaza to the rest of the conflicts they've studied.
Yeah, so Air Wars is an open source intelligence research firm, you could say, in the UK. What they do, and it's painstaking work, they go through local news accounts, social media accounts, basically everything you can find on the internet. And in doing that, they tally a list of civilians who were killed in individual incidents in conflict areas. So Air Wars found that in the first 25 days of the assault, October 7th to October 31st, somewhere between 6,300 and 8,100 civilians were killed in Gaza. And this is important to point out. These are civilian. Air Wars deliberately excludes militant deaths from its reporting. If militants are killed in an incident where civilians are also killed, they note that, but they specifically note that they're militants. So these are all civilian deaths. That 6,300 to 8,100 is 4 to 5 times more than in the worst month they have ever documented previously, which was Iraq in March of 2017. So in 25 days in Gaza, 4 to 5 times more civilians were killed than in Iraq in 2017, which, remember, is when Iraq was being bombed by the United States, Russia, and it was under the attack of ISIS. It was probably being bombed by Israel too. So these two superpowers and this regional superpower are attacking Iraq. 4 to 5 times more civilians were killed in Gaza in less time. But that still is kind of misleading because Iraq is a huge country compared to the Gaza Strip. Gaza is literally the size of Philadelphia. So if you adjust for the size of the population of the two countries, that means the rate of killing of civilians in Gaza was 88 to 113 times higher than it was in Iraq in March of 2017, which was, again, the worst month that Air Wars had ever studied for civilians. That's pretty shocking. The next thing I looked at was with the Air Wars data was the killing of children. And this is really something. Again, this is limited to the first 25 days of the assault on Gaza. In the first 25 days of the assault on Gaza, more children were killed than in the entire worst year of conflict that Air Wars had ever studied previously, which was Syria in 2016. In the first 25 days in Gaza, between 2,200 and 2,600 children were killed in Gaza, compared to 1,900 in Syria. So again, if you adjust for the size of the population, because Syria is a much bigger country than Gaza is a territory, the rate of killing of children in Gaza was 71 to 142 times higher than it was in the worst year on record for children in conflict, Syria in 2016. The other relevant conflict that, or the other modern conflict that Air Wars studied that I compared it to was Ukraine. So in the first 79 days of the Russian invasion of Kharkiv Oblast, that's one of the provinces of Ukraine that saw some of the worst fighting in the first days. Amnesty described it as reckless, and which is correct. In that 79 days, Russian forces killed between 30 and 33 Ukrainian children. 79 days. Now, Kharkiv Oblast is about the same size as the Gaza Strip in terms of population, but it has an older age distribution. So there's percentage-wise, there's fewer children. But even adjusting for all of that, the rate of killing of children in Gaza was still 114 to 118 times higher than it was in Kharkiv Oblast. And you can also compare to the overall invasion of the first year of the invasion of Ukraine. Russia invaded Ukraine in February of 2022. So in that first year, and this is now using United Nations data, not Air Wars data, in that first year, Russian forces killed 477 Ukrainian children. The rate of killing of children in Gaza actually works out to be almost 500 times higher than it is in Ukraine in that first year. There's nothing remotely equivalent to this. If you just look at the raw numbers even, it's still a huge differential, 4 or 5 times more. But when you actually adjust for the size of the population, which is the way you ought to do it, right? And it's the only thing that makes sense. The rate of killing is it's in a different universe. I mean, there's nothing equivalent to this going on today.
How much of this indifference is due to the Netanyahu blocking all journalists, including Israeli and American journalists, from ever entering into Gaza year after year, right to the present day, to do independent reporting?
Probably a significant amount. I mean, if American or Western journalists in general were allowed to go to Gaza and just see the things that everybody can see instantly when they're there, these numbers would become much more believable. The Ministry of Health numbers, like you said, would become much less believable. And furthermore, if they went and just sat down with the people who run the Ministry of Health and asked them, do you think this is a complete count? Their immediate answer would be no, we know it's not a complete count. There's tons of people who were buried without ever, because just in case people don't know, the Ministry of Health in Gaza, it only counts as dead people who were brought to a morgue in Gaza, or they died in a hospital and then were transferred to the morgue. Most morgues in Gaza are attached to hospitals. So it's hardly surprising that in a situation where 80% of buildings have been destroyed, where bombardment has been more intense and more concentrated than any other place in history, even including Dresden, even including Tokyo during the firebombings, there's nothing that comes close to this. There's no way you would think that this institutional centralized counting of dead bodies is going to be accurate. There's going to be a lot of situations where people, for example, are buried without ever being brought to a hospital because it was just too dangerous to pick up a body and walk it over to a hospital, walking through past Israeli military checkpoints, walking through unpredictable bombardment. That's just not the thing. Furthermore, the hospitals themselves were laid siege to repeatedly. Half of Gaza's hospitals just don't even function at all right now, and the other half barely function at all. It's kind of a miracle that they're able to do anything. Like the
Would you say there are tens of thousands of bodies under the rubble?
It would be shocking if there weren't. This is one of the issues that, if anybody's interested in reading details about this, part 2 of the series that you mentioned at the beginning covers a lot of this. But since about January of 2024, Gaza's civil defense has estimated that there are 10,000 people buried under the rubble. Now, it can't possibly be that there have been 10,000 people buried under the rubble from January of 2024 till today. That's crazy, right? There's been the massive amount of destruction beyond that. There's very, very little heavy moving equipment in Gaza, and there's very little fuel to run it. Kind of cynically, the only time that fuel was allowed in was right after the ceasefire was announced, because Hamas told the Israelis that they can't find the bodies of the Israeli captives to return them to Israel unless they have some heavy moving equipment. So they allowed a little bit of it in. There's been a lot of media about a recent Lancet Global, it's in the journal Lancet Global Health, a household survey that was done by a fellow named Michael Spigot and his whole team. And Spigot's a very serious researcher. I'm not trying to undermine him in any way. But I think if he had gone to Gaza, he wouldn't say some of the things that he says out loud. Like somebody asked him recently in a webinar, do you think that your household survey is an underestimate or an accurate estimate or an overestimate? He said, no, I think it's an accurate estimate because not very many bodies have been retrieved from rubble and then added to the Ministry of Health account. But this is just ridiculous. There's no way to retrieve bodies. Furthermore, a large amount of the destruction is outside of the yellow line, meaning it's under Israeli military control. Is somebody going to sneak past the Israeli military line, go find their destroyed home, pick up their dead child's body, and walk it back to Khan Yunis? This is absurd. Like, it's just completely insane to have to think that somebody could do this. Nobody knows how many, but there are certainly tens of thousands buried under the rubble.
The ministry also recognizes that they're not counting what are called collateral effects of the bombing itself: starvation, contaminated water, no health care, no medicines, for example, for diabetes or cancer, no antibiotics, no electricity, no fuel, no shelter. And that accounts often for 3 to 4 times the number that are counted dead from the bombing in casualty areas around the world. Isn't that true?
That's correct. Yeah, it's very difficult. Some authors have tried to do this, which I think is a mistake, but it's very difficult to compare one particular conflict and look at the ratio of what we call direct to indirect deaths and then apply that to a different conflict, because Gaza is such a unique place. In a lot of ways, it's more vulnerable than other places to indirect deaths, and in strange ways, it's less vulnerable. But what really matters there is exactly like you're saying. It would be genuinely shocking if fewer people have died of indirect causes in Gaza than direct causes. And there's a few reasons for that. Number one, Gaza is half children, and children are extremely vulnerable to the indirect effects of war. Starvation, displacement, interruption in medical care, interruption in vaccination care, contaminated water, contaminated food, et cetera, et cetera. Gaza is a place where infants freeze to death if they are not sheltered. Well, there are no sheltered infants in Gaza for any practical purposes. They're all unsheltered. So we have a list of, I think it's maybe a dozen or 2 dozen, the actual names of a dozen or 2 dozen children who have actually frozen to death. And people argue about this on Twitter as if they're experts. But yes, you can freeze to death in 50-degree weather if you're an infant, not if you're an adult, but that's different. But it's absolutely certain that there are many, many, many more that have died this way and have just been buried. What's the point of taking a frozen infant to the hospital? You know it's dead. I mean, it's just a hard, difficult thing to figure out. The Sarah Parkinson and I, she's a professor at Johns Hopkins University at SAIS. She and I wrote an article about this in November of 2024 in Foreign Policy, warning that this would happen, warning that dozens of infants would freeze to death. It did happen. Then we went a whole nother year onto a new winter in Gaza, and it happened again. And this was during a ceasefire now. Because remember, the ceasefire started in October of 2025, the ostensible ceasefire. And there is shelter, ready-made mobile shelters for hundreds of thousands of people right outside of Gaza. It's in Egypt and it's in Jordan. The only thing that's stopping anybody from bringing it in is the U.S. and Israel. And this isn't covered in the American press, or if it is, it's covered in one article and then never mentioned again, like that Times article I mentioned about the logistics people at the CMCC. You know, it's not the constant background that's being brought up about Gaza. This is just dastardly. We should kind of think about it for a second. We are, meaning Americans, you, me, everybody else on the call, I presume. We are living in a country where neither political party seems to care that we are freezing infants to death. It's very hard to understand what that means.
Starving infants to death.
Well, there's plenty of other. There's plenty more as well. I agree, Ralph. But that's the thing about Gaza. Each one of these things that we're doing should be like world shattering, but it's not. And it's so extreme that people seem to have gotten a little bit numb to it. I'm actually in Switzerland right now because I'm at a film festival. The reason I'm at a film festival is because somebody made a documentary about me and two other physicians, Thayer Ahmad and Mark Perlmutter, about our time working in Gaza. And it's going around to these festivals now, so you go and join the Q&A. The people who are coming to watch this movie, they, for the most part, know something about Gaza. They're not wholly ignorant. They know bad things happen there. But at the end of this movie, people are in such shock from what they've seen. It's not a particularly gory movie. It doesn't show, people getting their limbs ripped off or anything. But they're in such shock from what the Palestinian physicians have told us. It's part of it. They're in such shock from the treatment of children that they witnessed during the movie. I personally think the greatest shock that people experience with this movie, American Doctor, the shock that they experience from it is that it also shows me, Mark Thayer, and plenty of others going to Congress, and nobody cares. Like, literally no one cares what we're talking about. It's absolutely amazing. And I think people are aware that Gaza is bad, but each specific detail, it should shock people's conscience. It's just beyond understanding how we could have done this. A recent study of spontaneous abortions, miscarriages in Gaza, found that the live birth rate for children in Gaza has decreased by 40%. That's an absolutely astonishing number. And keep in mind, Gaza is a very, very young place with lots of pregnant women all over the place.
Well, there are 5,000 babies born a month, so 40% is a lot of babies.
Exactly. And so if 40% of those are dying at birth or before birth, spontaneous abortions can be reported.
I know our listeners are saying, what about the living? We don't want to underestimate the lifelong disability, the stunted brains of kids who are starved, the permanent disability of injuries plaguing all ages, and the constant deaths month after month, long after the conflict stops, because of what happened under the U.S. and Israeli bombardment. As you told me once, Feroze, most of the people you saw in Gaza who were living were sick. They were suffering from dysentery, injuries that were not taken care of in time. They had no wheelchairs, and so on.
Right now, the Israelis are blocking cough medicine from going into Gaza. And the reason they say is because it contains glycerin. Now, glycerin in theory can be used to make explosives, but it's, 1 picogram or something. It's just part of the pill or the syrup that goes into it, right? This is children's cough medicine. The idea that Hamas or Islamic Jihad or anybody else in Gaza has the laboratory equipment and facilities that would be needed to extract the 0.01% of glycerin that's in a pill or a medical syrup to then make a bomb is beyond idiotic. Furthermore, we all know that there's tons, and I'm speaking literally, hundreds of tons of unexploded Israeli bombs. Actually, I should say unexploded U.S. bombs all over the Gaza Strip. That's where Hamas gets all of its explosives from. It just repurposes unexploded Israeli munitions. So the idea, all of this is just sheer nonsense. And we're really hoping, we meaning the medical workers that have been in Gaza and who do go to Capitol Hill frequently, actually, we're hoping that the absurdity of all of this will eventually at least lead to Congress making a stink about the fact that aid is not being allowed into Gaza. That's hardly a solution to the problem. Gaza needs to be free, just like Palestine needs to be free. That's the actual solution to this problem. The Palestinians need the Israeli and American boots off their necks. That's what they need. But in the meantime, to at least stop the mass death that is going on in Gaza right now. Right now in Gaza, the situation is so bad that children, infants, are regularly being attacked by rodents at night. The rodent population has exploded so much because there's no way to dispose of trash or sewage that rodents are just coming into people's tents, these makeshift shelters that they've cobbled together, and are feeding on their children's faces. They're biting them on the cheek, they're biting them on the neck. You can imagine in a place where there's no antibiotics, what that is going to mean for an already starved and freezing child, right? So this is the kind of thing that we're doing right now. And I think we are very hopeful that if there's enough of a change in Congress, that at least people will be willing to make a stink about this. And hopefully that'll lead to some more openings in the American media as well. But, I've sent the New York Times other articles that I've written. I pitched it to actually one. You can read it now on a website called Think Global Health. It's a small, totally unread part of the Council on Foreign Relations website. But I wrote this article with Leonard Rubinstein. He's the world's leading expert on international law as it relates to healthcare. He runs this network that tracks attacks on healthcare throughout the world, the Safeguarding Health and Conflict Coalition. We wrote this article. We went through 4 or 5 rounds of edits with the New York Times, and then they just dropped it. The Times and the Post, and these are not the institutions that are going to reveal to the American public what's going on, unfortunately. But maybe if Congress changes, they love to follow power, so maybe they'll change a little bit as well.
Well, this is the Palestinian Holocaust. It will plague Israeli history indefinitely, just the way the Nazi Holocaust, and probably even more intensively because it's so proximate, so visible, so documented, unlike the Nazi Holocaust when it was going on in secret mostly. But there is a huge responsibility we all have to get Congress to start public hearings, and there's nothing to stop progressive Democrats from having a committee room with press and witnesses like Dr. Sidhwa and his colleagues in the House and Senate. They've already had shadow hearings on a lot of other subjects. Let's go to Steve.
Feroze, talk about the former Obama speechwriter, Sarah Hurwitz, what she said, and your response to her.
Yeah, so Hurwitz is kind of an interesting character. She wrote a book recently. I don't know exactly what the book's about. I haven't read it, to be clear. But because of this book, she was on a book tour. And in multiple venues, it's kind of surprising. I at first thought that these must be off-the-cuff remarks, but they definitely were not. In multiple venues, she has talked about how she finds it very difficult to have conversations with young Jewish people in the United States. And what she said is that you can't have a sane conversation with them. And then I'm quoting her now. You have TikTok just smashing our young people's brains all day long with video of carnage in Gaza. I want to give data and information and facts and arguments. And they are just seeing in their minds carnage, and I sound obscene. And it was kind of weird. Like, again, I just want to emphasize these were actually prepared remarks. She was reading. I didn't believe it until I saw the video myself. She's reading off of a notebook that she has with her. And she's repeated these remarks over and over and over again, just saying the problem is that these young Jewish people are seeing all the carnage in Gaza. And that's the issue, is that they can see it. This total inability to kind of read the room, I suppose you could say, is really astonishing. She went on to say that the lesson of the Holocaust, young Jewish people have internalized the lesson of the Holocaust, is again, I'm quoting her, the lesson of the Holocaust is that you fight the big, powerful people hurting weak people. So when on TikTok all day long, they see powerful Israelis hurting weak, skinny Palestinians, it's not surprising that they think, oh, I know, the lesson of the Holocaust is that you fight Israel. Okay, this is all her talking. She goes on and she says that these people are obviously drawing the wrong lesson from Holocaust education. The lesson of the Holocaust is not that you're supposed to help weak people fighting, being destroyed by strong people. Well, for me, I find that confusing because I always thought that was the lesson of the Holocaust too. I think everybody thinks that's the lesson of the Holocaust. But no, for her, the Holocaust is this narrow parochial thing that happened to Jews and only to Jews. And that's all that matters. It's a very, very weird thing because I went to college on the East Coast, and I trained on the East Coast. I happen to know lots and lots of Jews my age, American Jews my age. They don't think of the Holocaust this way. They don't think of the Holocaust as being this thing that only happened to Jews. And the only lesson that you're supposed to take from it is that you should support genocide of other people as long as Jews are doing it. It's just totally outrageous. And the vast majority are horrified by this way of thinking. I don't know how old Hurwitz is. I think she's probably maybe 10 years older than me or so. But the really amazing thing is that this would get like constant applause at all of these different events. And, it's just, but anyway, so that was one of the things that kind of prompted me to write the series of articles that I wrote in Zeteo, because, she says, I want to give the evidence and the arguments and the facts. It's totally disingenuous, but that's what she says. And so I said, well, okay, what does the data show? Actually, interestingly, for people who are interested in a more direct, because what I wrote about in Zeteo doesn't have anything to do with whether or not the U.S. and Israel committed genocide in Gaza. That's not what the articles are about. Plenty of people who have much more, they're credentialed to talk about that question have already weighed in on the subject. There's no need for me to do that. My opinion is just superfluous on the matter. But there is actually a recent study by Michael Spagat that it's on Vimeo if anybody wants to, the video service, if anybody wants to watch it. It's just a lecture. But he basically goes through different major conflicts, some of which are widely acknowledged to be genocidal, Srebrenica, Cambodia, things like that. And he just compares what he calls the demographic fingerprint, the number of men, women, and children killed in these places and their ages. The number of people killed in those categories in these other places that were widely acknowledged to be genocide. He compares it with Gaza, and he finds that Gaza is right in the middle of that stack, right in the middle of the genocide cluster. It's just not surprising. It's not confusing. And again, anybody who looks at the data can figure this out. There's another group that I quote a lot in these articles called Action on Armed Violence. It's also a British NGO. And they have gone through these very, very lengthy explanations of why the number of men killed in Gaza is not evidence, as these Israeli flunkies on Twitter and stuff like to pretend that, oh, look, 50% of the people killed were quote unquote fighting age males. That proves that Israel's not committing genocide in Gaza. No, it proves exactly the opposite. If you look at historical data, it proves literally the opposite of that. Maybe I'm naive, but I think that people do actually want to know the information and the facts. And I know these articles are very long and difficult to get through. But if somebody's interested in that data, the data and the facts that Horowitz claims to be invoking, that's where you can get a lot of it.
Before we close, can you tell our listeners about your report and how they can get it?
Anything that I've ever published is on my my Twitter account. So if you just look at that, you'll find it all there. But you can just Google my name or anything like that. But again, if somebody doesn't, the reports Ralph's talking about right now are on Zeteo. But if you don't have access to Zeteo, just email me and I'll send you the PDF. Not a big deal. Okay, then. So if they're going to access your website, spell out your name once more and we'll conclude this program. Sure. Yeah. It's FerozeSidhwa.org. FerozeSidhwa.org. And thank you for your courage, your commitment, your scholarship, your stamina, and your priorities, Dr. Feroze Sidhwa. Thanks, everybody. Nice to talk to you.
We've been speaking with Dr. Feroze Sidhwa. We will link to his work at RalphNaderRadioHour.com. I want to thank our guests again, Professor Nicholas Chater and Dr. Feroze Sidhwa. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap-Up. We'll have plenty of it for you. And it also features Francesco DeSantis with In Case You Haven't Heard. A transcript of this program will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour Substack site soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel. And for Ralph's weekly column, it's free at nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, it's at corporatecrimereporter.com.
The American Museum of Tort Law has gone virtual. You can visit tortmuseum.org to explore the exhibits, take a virtual tour, and learn about iconic tort cases from history.
To order your copy of the Capitol Hill Citizen, Democracy Dies in Broad Daylight, it's at capitolhillcitizen.com.
And remember to continue the conversation after each show. You can go to the comments section at RalphNaderRadioHour.com and post a comment or question on this week's episode.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt, Hannah Feldman, and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody.
Step up, you ought to step up. Rise up, rise up. I know you ought to rise up and stand up, stand up. You've been saying, I think you step up. I think that you should step up. Rise up, don't let the system hold you down. Stand up, stand up. You've been saying, step up, I think you should step up. Rise up, and you rise up because you have the power.